Hello, on today's video we're going to look at the opposition and the role which the leader of the opposition and the main opposition play in Parliament. Okay, so the opposition, basically there's two main roles of the opposition. One is to be an alternative government, and the second function is to criticise the government, criticise government policy, highlight issues, etc, etc. So they're the two main jobs. So when we're judging how effective is the opposition in Parliament, then they are kind of the two main areas to focus around. And one thing to remember about the opposition, when we refer to the opposition, what we mean is the parties in Parliament which are not part of the government. So at the moment, there's a Conservative government, so that's the Labour Party, Liberal Democrats, Greens, SNP, etc, etc. The largest party in opposition, which is currently the Labour Party, they're often termed as the official opposition. And the leader of the largest party in opposition is the leader of the opposition. They actually get money for opposing the government, from the government, ironically. It's called short money. I think it was a Labour minister in the 1970s, which is named after. So they actually get money to help them research, I suppose, in order to enable them to criticise the government. The leader of the opposition also gets like a car and various other kind of perks for having that job, and quite a decent wage for doing that as well. So in terms of thinking about the opposition, then, there are certain times which you might say it's been more effective than others. If we're looking at it in terms of being an alternative government, then in my lifetime, I was born at the end of 1976. Yeah, I know I don't look that old. So there's only been 3 changes of government in my lifetime. 1979, when Labour lost to the Conservatives, 1997, when the Conservatives lost to Labour, and 2010, when Labour lost to, I suppose, the coalition, wasn't it? They only just lost, I suppose, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. So if we're looking at it as an alternative government, I suppose you might argue there's only been 3 occasions in my lifetime, 46 years, where the opposition has looked like an alternative government, or enough to actually form the government. And when we're looking at those, obviously Mrs Thatcher led the opposition up until 1979. Tony Blair led the opposition between 1994 and 1997, which led to that landslide. And then, of course, you had David Cameron from 2005 up until 2010 for that period of opposition. And so you might say, on the basis of them forming governments, that they are the 3 occasions when they've been effective, I suppose, because they did actually defeat the governments. Just looking at those 3 factors then in a bit more detail, obviously Mrs Thatcher, she becomes leader of the opposition in 1975, I want to say, someone might correct me and say 74. Again, you had the Labour government, very small majority, the economy was not going well, you had then the so-called winter of discontent in 1979. Did that government lose because of Mrs Thatcher being in the opposition, or did that government lose because the economy was not going well? There's a bit of a judgment call how effective the opposition was. I know opinion polls all suggested that James Callaghan, who was the Prime Minister, was actually more of a popular figure than Mrs Thatcher, who was the leader of the opposition. Well, of course, you can take those things as they come. You might say part of Mrs Thatcher's skill in 1979 was developing policies and an agenda which was able to challenge the government and make them appear like a credible opposition. 1997 is the other occasion. Of course, we've already studied this when we did in Unit 1 about general elections and stuff, so we should have the background to the 1997 general election. But you had that period from 1990, I think it was 94, to 1997 when Tony Blair was leader of the opposition. Clearly they did appear like an alternative government, hence why they won the general election. And you remember from when we studied this back in the day about how Blair made a big effort to get the media on side, especially Rupert Murdoch. They developed those policies, those 5 pledges. The Labour Party appeared to have modernised, New Labour, new this, new that, if you remember. And he himself appeared a very popular figure in that period. A lot of the Labour campaign was focused around Tony Blair himself. In contrast, the government led by John Major, you will remember, was kind of falling apart, divided over the issue of Europe, They've been in government a long time, Thatcher and then Major, so 18 years by the time you get to 1997. This idea that people want to change, people are a bit fed up. There's been a big issue with the economy in 1992, etc., etc., etc. Although you might say, well, the same was true in 1992, only Labour didn't win that election. So obviously something had changed in that period. And then, of course, you have David Cameron, becomes leader of the opposition in 2005, very young, not associated with the divisions of the Conservatives in the recent past. Again, the Conservative Party was very divided over Europe. That continued when they got into opposition after the 1997 defeat. Cameron famously said we need to stop banging on about Europe. He tried to project the party as being more modern, talked about green issues, talked about youth unemployment, all those sorts of things. And obviously he won the election in 2010. At the same occasion, though, Labour, by the time you get to 2010, they've been in power for 13 years. They've been the financial crash of 2008-9. Gordon Brown, who'd taken over in 2007, was not as popular as Tony Blair had been. He didn't quite have the same kind of charisma and the same kind of populist touch, I suppose. And David Cameron wins that election. Well, kind of. It has to have the coalition, doesn't it? So they're the three periods where you could say they've been quite effective. In terms of criticising government policy, again, it's a bit more difficult to kind of judge, isn't it? I mean, they kind of do that all the time. And there's always a bit of an issue about, do you always criticise, or the times we had to support the government? So there were times, wasn't there, in the early days of the COVID thing where Keir Starmer kind of supported the government on this broad policy. That seems like a big emergency. Oppositions often tend to support the government over foreign policy issues against assuming the government's got a lot more information. So the Conservatives supported Blair in Iraq and Afghanistan in those early days, etc., etc. But there are some free hits which the opposition get. Obviously, when things go wrong, they can highlight these things. So look how Keir Starmer has been highlighting issues to do with the economy since the Liz Truss period, etc., etc. Within Parliament, there are 20 days reserved in a parliamentary year for the opposition to debate what they like. And of course, oppositions tend to highlight issues which they know are embarrassing for the government. A recent example, perhaps, of the government perhaps being embarrassed by the opposition, in fact, having some success, was in 2022 in October, when fracking. It was a very divisive issue within the Conservative Party. A lot of MPs were against it. Liz Truss, who was the Prime Minister at the time, was in favour. She tried to force all the Conservative MPs to support the fracking against the opposition. They had a vote. It led to scuffles, allegedly, with the Chief Whip. And it was the final straw for Conservative MPs and Liz Truss, and she lost power literally within 24 hours or so. Now, was that down to the opposition? Well, yeah, you could say they were quite clever raising that as an issue, or was it more down to the divisions within the Conservative Party? So there's always these things to have a look at when you're looking about the opposition. Now, to look at why are some oppositions more successful than others, we've only really got three periods there, which I would say they were successful in terms of changing government. Although, as I said, there's often, they get attention for a few days when they've embarrassed the government over some opposition day debate or something. I think there's certain factors, though, as to why, especially with alternative governments, that oppositions can be more effective than others. I think the first one is the strength and the popularity of the government. So, for example, if the government is popular, perhaps they've only just won a general election, people don't really care about the opposition for a bit. So when Tony Blair won that great big landslide in 1997, I don't think people really heard